We have, as you say, ISIS, Islamic State at the heart of the Middle East, Iran going nuclear, Russia on the move, China claiming territory that it doesn't really have a right to.
Reports by the day that show Russian troops are going further into southeastern Ukraine and helping turn the tide.
Can they be defeated without addressing that part of their organization which resides in Syria? The answer is no.
We're actively considering what's going to be necessary to deal with that threat, and we're not going to be restricted by orders.
Airstrikes. Bomb them. Bomb them. Keep bombing them. Bombing them again and again.
Contrary to popular belief, the conduct of nations on the international stage is almost never driven by moral considerations, but rather by a shadowy cocktail of money and geopolitics. As such, when you see the mouthpieces of the ruling class begin to demonize a foreign country, the first question on your mind should always be, what is actually at stake here? For some time now, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria have been in the crosshairs. Once you understand why, the events unfolding in the world right now will make much more sense. The US dollar is a truly unique currency. In fact, its current design and its relationship to geopolitics is unlike any other in history. Though it has been the world reserve currency since 1945, this is not what makes it unique. Many currencies have held their reserve status off and on over the centuries. But what makes the dollar unique is the fact that since the early 1970s it has been, with a few notable exceptions, the only currency used to buy and sell oil on the global market. Prior to 1971, the US dollar was bound to the gold standard, at least officially. According to the IMF, by 1966 foreign central banks held $14 billion in US dollars. However, the United States only had $3.2 billion in gold allocated to cover foreign holdings. Translation, the Federal Reserve was printing more money than it could actually back. The result was rampant inflation and a general flight from the dollar. In 1971, in what later came to be called the Nixon shock, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard completely.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
At this point, the dollar became a pure, debt-based currency. With debt-based currencies, money is literally loaned into existence. Approximately 70% of the money in circulation is created by ordinary banks, which are allowed to loan out more money than they actually have in their accounts. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which loans out money that they don't have, mostly to government. It's kind of like writing hot checks, except it's legal for banks. This practice, which is referred to as fractional reserve banking, is supposedly regulated by the Federal Reserve, an institution which just happens to be owned and controlled by a conglomerate of banks. And no agency or branch of government regulates the Federal Reserve.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Now, to make things even more interesting, these fractional reserve loans have interest attached, but the money to pay that interest doesn't exist in the system. As a result, there's always more total debt than there is money in circulation, and in order to stay afloat, the economy must grow perpetually. This is obviously not sustainable. Now, you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years, if it's really little more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Well, this is where the dollar meets geopolitics. In 1973, under the shadow of the artificial OPEC crisis, the Nixon administration began secret negotiations with the government of Saudi Arabia to establish what later came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, Saudis would only sell their oil in US dollars and would invest the majority of their excess profits into US banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The interest and payments on these loans would of course be denominated in US dollars. This agreement was formalized in the US-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in 1974. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975. Though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices, this arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on US monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent a flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the U.S. economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Did you ever wonder how it is that the U.S. holds such a disproportionate amount of the world's wealth when 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-based? In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have become integrated into every aspect of civilization. Agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense, medicine, and demand just keeps growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in US dollars, there will be a demand for US dollars. And that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real, tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the U.S. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar, and easily the most important geopolitical event of the year. But only one article in the Western media even mentioned it. In the same month that Saddam announced he was moving away from the dollar, an organization called the Project for a New American Century, of which Dick Cheney just happened to be a member, released a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This document called for massive increases in U.S. military spending and a much more aggressive foreign policy in order to expand U.S. dominance worldwide. However, the document lamented that achieving these goals would take many years, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, end quote. 1 year later, they got it. Riding the emotional reaction to 9/11, the Bush administration was able to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and pass the Patriot Act all without any significant resistance.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this wasn't a question of bad intelligence. This was a cold, calculated lie, and the decision to invade was made in full knowledge of the disaster that would follow.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not? Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west, part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim fought over for 8 years. In the north you've got the Kurds. If the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you've threatened the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take it.
They knew exactly what was going to happen. But in 2003, they did it anyway. Once Iraqi oil fields were under U.S. control, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar. Mission accomplished. Soon after the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration attempted to extend these wars to Iran. Supposedly, the Iranian government was working to build a nuclear weapon. After the Iraq fiasco, Washington's credibility was severely damaged. As a result, they were unable to muster international or domestic support for an intervention. Their efforts were further sabotaged by elements within the CIA and Mossad, who came forward to state that Iran had not even made the decision to develop nuclear weapons, much less begin an attempt. However, the demonization campaign against Iran continued, even into the Obama administration. Why? Well, might it have something to do with the fact that since 2004, Iran has been in the process of organizing an independent oil bourse? The Iranians were building their own oil market, and it wasn't going to be tied to the dollar. The first shipments of oil were sold through this market in July of 2011. Unable to get the war that they wanted, the US used the UN to impose sanctions against Iran. The goal of the sanctions was to topple the Iranian regime. While this did inflict damage on the Iranian economy, the measures failed to destabilize the country. This was due in large part to Russia's assistance in bypassing US banking restrictions. In February of 2009, Muammar Gaddafi was named chairman of the African Union. He immediately proposed the formation of a unified state with a single currency. It was the nature of that proposed currency that got him killed. In March of 2009, the African Union released a document entitled Towards a Single African Currency. Pages 106 and 107 of that document specifically discuss the benefits and technicalities of running the African Central Bank under a gold standard. On page 94, it explicitly states that the key to the success of the African Monetary Union would be the, quote, eventual linking of a single African currency to the most monetary of all commodities, gold. In 2011, the CIA moved into Libya and began backing militant groups in their campaign to topple Gaddafi. And the US and NATO pushed through and stretched a UN no-fly zone resolution to tip the balance with airstrikes. The presence of al-Qaeda extremists among these rebel fighters was swept under the rug. Libya, like Iran and Iraq, had committed the unforgivable crime of challenging the US dollar. The NATO intervention in Libya segued into a covert war on Syria. The armories of the Libyan government were looted, and the weapons were shipped via Turkey to Syrian rebels working to topple Assad. It was already clear at this point that a large percentage of these fighters had ties to terrorist organizations. However, the US national security apparatus viewed this as a necessary evil. In fact, the Council on Foreign Relations published an article in 2012 stating that, quote, the influx of jihadis brings discipline, religious fervor, battle experience from Iraq, funding from Sunni sympathizers in the Gulf, and most importantly, deadly results. In short, the FSA needs al-Qaeda now, end quote. In 2013, these same al-Qaeda-linked Syrian rebels launched 2 sarin gas attacks. This was an attempt to frame Assad and muster international support for military intervention. Fortunately, they were exposed by UN and Russian investigators, and the push for airstrikes completely fell apart when Russia stepped in to broker a diplomatic solution. The campaign for regime change in Syria, as in Libya, has been presented in terms of human rights. Obviously, this isn't the real motive. In 2009, Qatar put forth a proposal to run a natural gas pipeline through Syria and Turkey to Europe. Assad, however, rejected this. And in 2011, he forged a pact with Iraq and Iran to build a pipeline eastward, cutting Qatar and Saudi Arabia out of the loop completely. Not surprisingly, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have been the most aggressive regional players in the push to topple the Syrian government. But why would this pipeline dispute put Syria in Washington's crosshairs? 3 reasons. 1. This pipeline arrangement would significantly strengthen Iran's position, allowing them to export to European markets without having to pass through any of Washington's allies. This obviously reduces the US government's leverage. 2. Syria is Iran's closest ally. Its collapse would inherently weaken Iran. And 3. Syria and Iran have a mutual defense agreement. the US intervention in Syria could open the door to open conflict with Iran. In February of 2014, this global chess game heated up in a new venue, Ukraine. The real target, however, was Russia. You see, Russia just happens to be the world's second largest oil exporter. And not only have they been a thorn in Washington's side diplomatically, but they also opened up an energy bourse in 2008 with sales denominated in rubles and gold. Russia has also been in the process of organizing a Eurasian Economic Union, which includes plans to adopt a common currency unit and which is slated to have its own independent energy market. Leading up to the crisis, Ukraine had been presented with a choice: either join the EU under an association agreement or join the Eurasian Union. The EU insisted that this was an either-or proposition. Ukraine couldn't join both. Russia, on the other hand, asserted that joining both posed no issue. President Yanukovych decided to go with Russia. In response, the US national security apparatus did what it does best: it toppled Yanukovych and installed a puppet government. To see the full evidence of Washington's involvement in the coup, watch the Ukraine crisis, which you're not being told. Though this all seemed to be going well at first, the US quickly lost control of the situation. Crimea held a referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine and reunify with Russia. The transition was orderly and peaceful. No one was killed. Yet the West immediately framed the entire event as an act of Russian aggression. And this became the go-to mantra from that point on. Crimea is important geostrategically because of its position in the Black Sea, which allows for the projection of naval power into the Mediterranean. Now, the US has been pushing for Ukraine's inclusion into NATO for years now. Such a move would place US forces right on Russia's border, and could have potentially resulted in Russia losing their naval base in Crimea. This is why Russia immediately accepted the results of the Crimean referendum and quickly consolidated the territory. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, two regions declared independence from Kiev and held referendums of their own, the results of which overwhelmingly favored self-rule. Kiev responded to this with what they referred to as anti-terrorist operations. In practice, this was a massive and indiscriminate shelling campaign which killed thousands of civilians. Apparently, killing civilians didn't qualify as aggression to the West. In fact, the IMF explicitly warned the provisional government that their $17 billion loan package could be in danger if they were not able to put down the uprising in eastern Ukraine. While the war against eastern Ukraine was raging, elections were held and Petro Poroshenko was elected president. Turns out that Poroshenko was exposed by a leaked diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks in 2008 as having worked as a mole for the US State Department since 2006. They referred to him as our Ukraine insider, and much of the cable referred to information that he was providing. Having a puppet in place, however, hasn't turned out to be enough to give Washington the upper hand in this crisis. What does Washington do when they have no other leverage? They impose sanctions, they demonize, and they saber rattle. This isn't a very good strategy when dealing with Russia. In fact, it's already backfired. Sanctions have merely pushed Russia and China into closer cooperation and have accelerated Russia's de-dollarization agenda. And in spite of the rhetoric, this has not led to Russia being isolated. The US and NATO have put a wedge between themselves and Russia, but not between Russia and the rest of the world. This new anti-dollar axis goes deeper than economics. These countries understand what's at stake here. This is why in the wake of the Ukrainian crisis, China has proposed a new Eurasian Security Pact, which would include Russia and Iran. Consider the implications here as the Obama administration begins bombing in Syria, which also has a mutual defense agreement with Iran. This is not the Cold War 2.0. This is World War 3.0. The masses may not have figured it out yet, but history will remember it that way. Alliances are solidifying and hot wars are underway on multiple fronts. If the provocations and proxy wars continue, it's only a matter of time before the big players confront each other directly, and that is a recipe for disaster. Does all of this sound insane to you? Oh, you're right. The people running the world right now are insane, and the public is sleepwalking into a tragedy.
Right now, with the situation in ISIS, how do you break it down? What's your understanding of it?
Well, world wars change worlds. And if you have a global agenda, then global problems allow you to offer global solutions. And if you look how the world was transformed by the First World War and the Second World War, the world was a completely different place after both of those wars. And the idea all along has been to have a third world war to complete the transformation into a global state with a world government and a world army. dictating to the global population. And there was a letter, a controversial letter, because people dismiss it, but with the passage of events, it becomes more and more credible. And it was a letter written by a man called Albert Pike, who was a massive Freemason in the United States in the 19th century. And it was to another Illuminati infamous character called Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini. And it detailed 3 world wars that would transform global society. And the first one described it in the terms that happened. The second one it described in terms that it happened. But, you know, you can say, well, it came to light later, so, you know, maybe they just put that in and faked the accuracy of the first 2 wars. So the credibility of what it said lies in what it said about the Third World War. And it talked about creating a conflict between the Muslim world and what it called political Zionism. And people will say, well, that's got to be a fake because there was no Zionism when that letter was supposed to be written. Well, this is an agenda that's projected a long way forward. This is why Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, and Eric Blair, George Orwell, 1984, who knew each other. Huxley taught George Orwell French at Eton College, where the royals go, and they knew each other and they became friends. And from the same sources, not least the Fabian Society in Britain, they understood the projected agenda. And we're talking there in 1932 that Huxley's book was published, 1948 that Orwell's book was published, and they are describing the society that's unfolding today at that time. And there are many other examples of people predicting the future who were insiders who have turned out to be incredibly accurate. So the idea that Albert Pike would know that this Zionist movement was coming and the establishment of Israel was coming is very credible when you look at the background evidence. And of course, Zionism was established not that long after this letter was supposed to be written. And so he was talking about the Muslim world being brought into a war with the political Zionism, what today we call Israel, and that this would, you know, in my terms, create a vortex that would draw in the world, in our terms, America, the European Union, NATO, into this war. And what you have now is a situation that this ISIS group has come out of nowhere, in effect, incredibly well armed, incredibly funded. I mean, I've seen figures like $2 billion at its disposal. And it's walking into towns in Iraq and taking them over. It's established itself at the key border crossings into Syria and into Jordan. And it's all happened really fast. And what the potential of this clearly is to do what Pike was talking about. Because I've said in my books for years that the plan was to create a massive divide and rule conflict between the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims. I mean, I know it's hard to believe for anyone frickin' sane, but this argument over, this ancient argument over who should, you know, be the natural successor to, the rightful successor to Muhammad and all that stuff, has created this enormous schism. And schisms are there to be manipulated and exploited by these people. So what you have, therefore, is this ISIS that suddenly appeared with its grotesque violence that is representing Sunni Muslims. And then you have the regime currently in Iraq that is representing, in effect, Shia Muslims. And you have, just across the border, the center of the Shia Muslim world, and that's Iran. Iran, 89% I think it is, of Iranian Muslims are Shia. Now, in the last little while, there's been this, apparently on the face of it, this strange change of direction by America in terms of Iran. They've spent all these years with Israel saying, well, you know, we must take out their nuclear facilities and these sanctions against them, and they're terrible. And now, if you remember, in the last week or so, they've even been talking about maybe they ought to get into discussions with Iran and come to some agreement on how they deal with this ISIS situation. And it's like, what? Yeah. But when you come from this perspective, what they're doing is they're trying to draw Iran into this Sunni Shia conflict, like, you know, protect the Shia that this Sunni ISIS are threatening and overrunning at the moment. And once they get Iran pulled into that vortex, it ain't going to get out. Yeah. Then there's another aspect of this, which is a real red flag for me, and that is this ISIS organization is very extreme, and its very name, when you break down the wording, is describing its ambitions, and that's to take over Iraq, to take over Syria, and to take over what they call the Levant. And what does the Levant include? Israel. So here you have this extreme Muslim group, or actually the army, actually saying in its own name that our intention is to take over the Levant, to take over Israel. And you'd think at any other time, even with a lesser situation, Netanyahu would be surrounded by microphones and he'd be saying, we must be protected, Israel is in danger. Instead, he's come out and said, oh no problem, you leave them to it. America, no, don't intervene, leave them to it, let them basically weaken each other. And then you've got the United States, their reaction. I mean, it sums up the ludicrous nature of it, that John Kerry has gone to Iraq and he said, well, we don't know about bloody airstrikes because, you know, we might kill civilians. Well, that's never stopped you in the past, mate, has it? Or any of your predecessors. And what it seems to me as I'm reading this is that they're all standing off to let this ISIS get a big foothold in that region. And then if it moves to the point where it starts to threaten Israel, then the button will be pressed. Then the Americans and NATO will come in because they're committed to protecting Israel's security. And then you'll start to see why that sliver of land called Israel, with less than 8 million people, has one of the best equipped armies in the world and a nuclear arsenal. Because what Pike was talking about was drawing all these different disparate groups in and creating this vortex of mutual self-destruction, which would change the war that would change the world, taking on from the previous world wars that changed the world, and then at that point their global fascist society would be brought in. No doubt justified by, we need a world government and we need a world army to stop this ever happening again, even though we who are saying that actually created it. And then you've got what I've been saying now way back in the 1990s. The idea is for this Third World War to involve Russia and China against the West.
Yeah. Oceania versus Eurasia, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1984 kind of scenario. And what you have now is the demonization of Russia. Have you noticed that? How suddenly we got the demonization of Russia? And what's opening up in the Ukraine, while all this is starting to go on in the Middle East, is another front against Russia. Because, you know, it's very easy to see how Russia can be pulled into this Middle Eastern conflict by supporting Syria, because destroying Syria is part of ISIS's agenda and American agenda and NATO's agenda.
And also Iran as well.
Yeah, and destroying Iran, yeah. So, and Russia would come out in support of Iran. And the same would happen with China. And so you can see how it's how the pieces in the game are being moved around to create this scenario that Pike talked about. In fact, a close aide of President Putin, who has special responsibility for Ukraine, has actually said this week that the United States is preparing for a war against Russia through Ukraine, and that what they plan is to try to take Crimea back. Now, you can have the odd bit of terrorism and bad things happen in Ukraine to Russian supporting people, and Putin can stay back and hold his fire because he knows what they're trying to manipulate him into. But if they try to take Crimea back, Putin's ego and Putin's pride will no way, I would strongly suspect, allow him just to let them do it.
Exactly.
And therefore, that if they try to take Crimea back, then what you're looking at is a war, or a calculated war against Russia. Yeah. And if you start a front against Russia on its borders, and then all this stuff going on in the Middle East, you are diluting Russia's impact on what's happening in the Middle East. Yeah. And it's all a setup. And when you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are 51st states of the United States, there are many of those, mind, funding this ISIS and funding this terrorism, while the Americans, who could tell them to stop any time, are saying, are condemning the very terrorism that their 51st states are supporting. Well, the picture's so bloody obvious. It's a setup, and it's a setup to attempt to trigger World War III.
Eu fiz a reunião com o ministro Toffoli. Por quê? Porque aí eu vou contar uma coisa para vocês. O ministro Toffoli e nós temos um interesse em comum, que é o cadastramento e a identificação de cada um de nós com um documento. Hoje, cada um de nós pode ter até 20 documentos. Nós temos certidão de nascimento, certidão de casamento, nós temos carteira de motorista, carteira de identidade, carteira do trabalho, título do SUS, cartão de crédito. Nós temos uma pletora de documentos. Nós lançamos, há um tempo atrás, o programa Bem Mais Simples Brasil. Lançamos com quem? Com o ministro Afife, que é o coordenador no governo federal dessa simplificação. O ministro Toffoli tem um processo interessantíssimo, muito importante, que é, ele desenvolve o quê? Depois que nós fizemos a urna eletrônica, tá? Eles desenvolveram a urna que você, o voto que você vai por digital. Então, o que que nós estamos discutindo? Nós estamos discutindo como justiça eleitoral, que já tem no orçamento, que está gastando. Governo federal, que tem no orçamento e está gastando. Como é que nós nos juntamos, diminuímos o gasto e olhamos como fazer de forma rápida, o mais rápido possível, a simplificação da vida do cidadão do nosso país e da cidadã, porque essa é a nossa semana, né, meninas? E da cidadã também. Qual é o intuito? É transformar qualquer documento num só, com um registro só. E aí, você terá um chip. Eu estou falando o seguinte, ainda não está elaborado. Documento num só, com um registro só. E aí, você terá um chip. Documento num só, com um registro só. E aí, você terá um chip. Qual é o intuito? É transformar qualquer documento num só, com um registro só. E aí, você terá um chip, eu estou falando o seguinte, ainda não está elaborado, isso está em discussão. Aí teria um chip, e esse chip poderia, tá? Se você que fosse tirar uma carteira de motorista, você teria as informações centralizadas e armazenadas, tá? E a gente está discutindo a possibilidade disso ser feito pela Justiça Eleitoral. É essa a discussão.